Welcome to the Full Mutuality podcast. I'm Gail.
I'm Nate.
And on today's episode, we're going to be having a conversation about the Asian American experience in 2021.
Yeah, it would have to be, given that 2022 just started. I don't really have a whole lot of experience in 2022 to talk about it.
Yeah, so I had a bunch of lighthearted questions, but since it's just the two of us and we're not interviewing anyone, I'll get right into our topic. But maybe a good question to start us off would be, why did you finally agree to do this, Nate?
I don't know. So first, I guess we have a podcast now, so that's kind of what changed. The other thing, too, was I was listening to another podcast. It seems to always come around to podcasts, doesn't it? So I was listening to this podcast called Dear Asian Americans. It's hosted by Jerry Wan, I think. And he made a comment at the end of one episode, and I can't remember exactly which episode it was, but he had made a comment about how we need to share our stories. You know, nobody can take away your personal stories. You know, we can get into debates and discussions about ideas, philosophies, political policies. But when it comes to your individual story and your experience, no one can take that away from you. And he encouraged his audience to share what their stories were in whatever form, whether it was in some kind of art or podcast or music or whatever. And that kind of, I guess, served as a catalyst for me to start thinking through my own experience as unformed as my thoughts are, and as broken as my thoughts kind of are. They're sort of all over the place, and I don't really know how to express my experience. I feel like where I am in this chapter in my life and everything that's kind of happened over the last couple of years serves as a great opportunity to talk about it, to share what has been going on, how I've been perceiving the landscape of the Asian American experience in these last couple of years. So
I'm really excited that you're willing to do this, because I do remember presenting this to you in the past. And you just mentioned, you know, as unformed as your thoughts are, like on this topic, you can talk very well and eloquently on many topics without a lot of prep. There's a lot of topics you're very comfortable jumping into that may be social justice oriented, but I know this one is much more personal to you. And I know a lot of our conversations in the background have been a lot more unfiltered and have been a lot more raw. And I understand that this topic is probably more difficult in that way to get into. And I remember listening, you made me listen to that Dear Asian American podcast. And I just thought that was so inspiring, that quote about whatever your story is, to like that, realizing it's valuable and that you should share. So I'm pumped and I'm excited that you're willing to go there and that we're having this conversation. I know it's probably a lot more personal to you than a lot of stuff that we've had conversations about. So thank you for being willing to share your story.
Yeah.
So how did growing up around white people influence the way you saw your Asian background?
Oh, well, so diving right into it, huh?
That's what I said. You wanted to go with the hard-hitting stuff, the meat from the get-go.
Yeah. I would say, like, so in talking about my experience growing up, I think I would start with the fact that I didn't want to be Asian. I didn't have much to draw on as far as representation in mass media. You know, growing up, I was, big nerd. I loved superheroes and whatnot. And my favorite superhero growing up was Superman. And I think part of it was his relatability to me, being an immigrant and me being a child of immigrants and Superman being kind of the immigrant.
You saw yourself as Superman.
Yeah, there was sort of this, no, not exactly, but there's a relatability to that. He
didn't belong.
He didn't belong. And I thought that I love any Superman story that highlights that sense of unbelonging that the character has. So, Smallville did a good job of that to a degree, aside from all the teen angst that a CW show has. But I think for me, the thing about Superman, though, is that he's white passing. And anytime Superman is portrayed, he's played by a white person. And so it's hard to see yourself in mass media as a kid. And I wanted to, I dressed up as Superman for Halloween when I was little, I wanted to be like that.
Such a cute picture. I have pictures.
But That's not, nobody's going to see those.
Oh, show notes or something. Gonna figure something out.
Nope. I'm the producer, so I get to control all of
Maybe we'll
that.
make a Patreon one day and we'll throw it into our Patreon rewards.
Yeah.
You want to see cute Nate as Superman as a little kid. It's adorable.
Yeah. Join the Patreon or whatever. It's non-existent right now, but we'll make that the gold tier.
This is really up there.
Yeah. So I would say that the challenge was that I didn't see myself represented, and so I also didn't feel like I necessarily belonged anywhere, because it was hard to imagine myself fitting in somewhere. All of my friends were white, and then as you
How
know,
many Asian people went to your school growing up?
When I was really young, I was
Like elementary school in general?
So elementary school, I did live in an area that had a lot of Asian people. But the thing is, I went to fundamentalist school, and fundamentalism is by and large a pretty white environment. And so when I was little, there were a couple of other Asian kids in my class. But as you know, I got into middle school and high school, Asian kids left. I think, Asian parents by and large like to expose their kids to larger to environments that can provide a fuller, whether it's music or the arts or deeper education. And fundamentalist schools, private Christian schools, just can't provide those environments. They don't have the funding, they don't have the education level, the expertise. They don't have it. So
They dropped out.
Yeah, a lot of the Asian kids that I grew up with dropped out. I didn't. My family was very committed to our religious upbringing, to our religious environment, and we stuck around. And
well, that brings me to your church. Was there a lot of Asians in your church, or were you guys the only family?
No, we were one of maybe 2 or 3 families total, and that was hard, especially given the fact that I lived in an area with a lot of East Asian and South Asian, with a very large East Asian and South Asian population.
And church wasn't a once a week thing if you grew up in fundamentalism. This is like where you spend 2, 3, 4 days a week.
Yeah. So more than that. I mean, because I went to the school, so I was there Monday through Friday for school, and then Wednesday night prayer meeting or youth group, and Sunday basically all day, because we had, Sunday school early morning, we had service, and we had morning service, and we had evening service. And then I was in the choir, so I was there for other stuff as well. Anyway, all that to say,
lots of time around mostly all white people.
Yeah.
And okay, here's a question. What things have white people said to you? Maybe we can go back to elementary, high school, just talking about how white people might have influenced the way you saw your Asian background. Yeah. Was there anything that white people said to you that seemed nice at the time, but was actually harmful to you? Yeah.
So, when I remember when I was in college, actually, I had a friend who said, "Nate, you don't even strike me as like, an Asian friend. I see you as like, one of my white friends." Or something to that effect, which at the time I was like, oh, that means I fit in, right?
That's how you received it.
That's how I felt about it back then. But the thing is, being half Japanese, half Filipino, there's no way for me to hide my Asian appearance, You're
not white passing.
So yeah, even though my friends might think, oh yeah, you fit in with white people. You talk like us, you walk and dress and act like us. I don't look like them. So that's not an environment that I can actually just enter without feeling like an outsider at some level. So to hear somebody say, I don't see you as an Asian person. I see you as like one of us. On the surface, it feels great because for my entire life, I have felt like that sort of nagging feeling like I don't belong in an environment. But when I really think about that, there is a lack of recognition of who I intrinsically am and what my culture, my upbringing, what all of that means to me. And it also ignores the hard truth that I will never truly belong in those spaces. So,
can you think of any comments you heard that were much more directly negative about your culture growing up, maybe sitting around lunch school table?
Oh yeah, like I mean, some of the stuff that the TV show Fresh Off the Boat kind of accentuates, like the main character goes into school. He brings the food that his mom packed for him. He opens up the container and all of his friends at his lunch table are like, oh, that smells. What's wrong? I didn't have anything that was quite that overt, but I did get some, like I brought like a package of nori in for snack time when I was in, I think, second grade. And if you're not familiar, nori is dried seaweed, those flat seaweed that you can find it at mostly any Asian shop, and it's a nice little salty, crunchy snack. And in nowadays, I'm sure that's probably less weird to see, because I notice a lot of people enjoy eating nori as a snack. But when I was a kid, nobody knew what that was. None of my classmates had ever seen nori before. And when you open the package, there's a bit of a smell. It's not a very pungent one, but there's a little bit of a smell that escapes from the package. And, the kids definitely were riled up about it at snack time, and we're like, oh, what is that? Oh, and I say, oh, it's seaweed. And the kids are like, oh, you're eating seaweed. So it became a big distraction. And my teacher told me not to bring those snacks in again, because it was a distraction, and the class was, acting out, and she couldn't get control of the class because everybody was reacting to my snack.
That's kind of wild, thinking that like you're basically being like, in terms of not feeling like you belong or that you don't fit, or that might make you want to distance yourself from your own culture.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Your own food being told like you're a distraction by bringing in your own food.
Oh yeah. It's hard when and this is as well. And I can think of, one of my friends when I was in elementary school, who was probably my closest friend, in first, second, third grade, was this Taiwanese kid who would also bring in some of the food that his mom prepared for lunch or whatever, and it was a similar kind of experience for him as well, I'm sure. And I think of again, going back to the TV show Fresh Off the Boat, I think of how the character Jessica wants to, really preserve her Chinese heritage and culture for her kids. But her kids are wrestling with the fact that, especially her oldest son, wrestling with the fact that he really wants to fit in his school. He has a persona that he wants to put out there. But she's trying to translate to her kids, like, no, your Chinese heritage is good and it's healthy, and please hold on to it.
Be proud of it. And it must be so weird too, because like looking back, and I like Fresh Off the Boat for so many reasons. One of them is that it sort of takes place in the 80s or 90s, like when we were growing up. So it has the vibe of like going back in time when you're watching it.
Yep.
But I mean, one of the other things that it makes me think of when it comes to Asian food, you brought it up. Now people eat Asian food. White people are much more like, white people will just talk to you about the sushi they made, or they think Asian food is so cool now, which is a big sort of a change from, how probably what you experienced as a kid in bringing in Asian food back then. How does that feel like on the other end now that it's like, ooh, it's so cool and it's so trendy and it's.
Yeah, there's a little bit of that appropriation feeling to some degree. I mean, some of it is exciting to see, but other times there's also, and I saw somebody post about this somewhere, and it was a long time ago, so I don't really remember it clearly. But what I think is a little bit on the frustrating side is when you see certain cuisines or certain dishes that are being, recipes that are being put up there, and there's no mention of kind of the heart and soul behind that dish. I can't think of the exact example off the top of my head right now, but I do recall seeing a recipe and thinking, wait, this is like a Vietnamese recipe. And, I think it was, like a YouTube channel, might have been like Bon Appetit. I think this was some of the controversy surrounding Bon Appetit. And they had these different dishes that were from particular cultures, and the chefs that they had who were making the dishes weren't acknowledging the cultures that they were coming from, and were making the dishes and talking about the excitement of using these ingredients and so on and so forth. And I think it's jarring for Asian Americans to have had those experiences with their food. I think Korean people in particular, because kimchi is such a pungent smell. And I remember a story that I read somewhere of a girl whose mom, I think the landlord had told her to stop making that food because neighbors were complaining in the building. And then to see that it's now something trendy that people, white people are going to restaurants and ordering it and they're excited about it. Meanwhile, they're being asked by their landlords to not make it in their homes. It's hard. It's difficult because these are things that we were made fun of or told not to do for so long. And then to see them become trendy now with no acknowledgement of what has happened, of how we were treated because of our food.
And not even an acknowledgement of which cultural food this is or who the chef's behind it, or even that it's an Asian dish. Sort of like, taking it.
And it's even, I think of how Chinese people are perceived and Chinese restaurants are perceived, with, they're probably, cooking cats or dogs.
I've heard that growing up. I definitely remember hearing that a lot about Chinese restaurants.
Yeah. They don't know what the ingredients are. Therefore, they must be
suspicion around.
Yeah.
It being negative and dirty and Yeah.
And it's a stereotype that has not left. I saw recently there's a page I follow on Facebook that does these little, cartoon memes or whatnot. And one that they posted that was a little bit jarring. It was like this cartoon, like a 2 or 3 panel cartoon. And there was like an alien, coming to Earth, landing on Earth. And this Chinese man makes first contact with the alien, and then the next frame has him eating the alien out of a bowl with chopsticks because it was squid-like looking. And I'm like, really? This is still happening? We're still having these sorts of stereotypes being perpetuated.
And I feel like people are unaware of even the fact that they're doing it and what messaging is behind and what that's continuing to express.
Right. I mean, and also that was one of the myths behind how COVID started. Like, people were making comments like, these Chinese people and the animals that they're eating, that's caught up to them now. And now we have this global pandemic, Obviously, that's not something that became pervasive, but I heard
comments like that.
I remember early on in the pandemic, comments like that going around. So,
okay, all hard-hitting questions to start off. Here's one: what is unique? Maybe before I say that, you're just to preface this. Your dad was not born in the U.S. He was born in Japan, born and raised there.
Yeah.
Before he moved here when he was a young adult. So what is unique to being Asian American, or can you describe what might make you feel stuck in between two very different cultures? Because you were born here.
Yeah. I think one of the things that I'm like often reflecting on is the fact that being Japanese American, there is a Japanese American story, a very deep and painful Japanese American story that I don't have a connection to. Even though I am Japanese American who was born here, I don't have a connection to that because my dad immigrated here following World War II. But I know that there is this history of Japanese Americans during World War II that I don't know how to process that. Because there's an affinity that I have with the Japanese American community being Japanese American, but I don't.
It's not directly part of your story.
It's not part of my story. I don't have that in my history. I don't have that in my heritage. So,
and you're speaking specifically of Japanese Americans being put in internment camps.
Yeah.
In World War II, and they did that in Canada as well.
Yeah.
North America. That's how they handled their Japanese population.
Right. Right. And so to know that story and that history exists, to know that the history of Japanese Americans who had been here for generations, who they put up signs saying, I am American.
That didn't matter.
It didn't matter. Their status, the length of time that they spent here, none of that mattered. They were put into concentration camps. So it's a history that I think I don't really know what to do with. I don't know how to approach that. But much like Asian American history, by and large, there's a lot that none of us have really processed. The history of Chinese slavery in the U.S. to build the Transcontinental Railroad. It's interesting to know that there is a shared history between Chinese Americans and Black Americans when it comes to chattel slavery. Of course, I don't want to minimize the experience of Black Americans, because that's something entirely quantifiably different from what Chinese Americans experienced. But the similarity is that they were chosen and placed into slavery because of their race to do certain things, whether it was Black Americans working the plantations, Chinese Americans working the railroad. There is that similar harrowing history, but I think we as Asian Americans haven't really figured out what to do with any of that. And I think there's been, I don't know, there have been conversations that I've heard, and I'm not even really sure how to think through any of that as well, being that I'm not Chinese American. So
we'll get into some questions and try and dig into some of that.
Yeah.
I want to ask, what do you wish white people knew about engaging in conversation with your Japanese heritage?
Well, something that I've come to recently is that, and as part of my own responsibility, is to also acknowledge the fact that I'm not just half Japanese, I'm half Filipino.
We've had some good conversations about this together.
Yeah. And I think
I want to elaborate on that.
Yeah. What's important to me is, there are all sorts of things. So kind of setting aside answering your question for a minute, there's a lot that I have to kind of wrestle with internally, right? As somebody who has a Japanese name, I don't have a Filipino name. So I have an American name and I have a Japanese name. And so I recognize that my Japanese identity is a little bit easier to latch onto. It's easier for me to say I'm Japanese American because when you hear my name, you hear, oh, that makes sense, as Japanese.
You're Nate and a cow.
Right. So there's that part of it, which I guess from the outside looking in, it's understandable. But there's also the part of it that I want to acknowledge, that there is a hierarchy in Asia that has also kind of translated to the West, in that there's the more prestigious, quote unquote, Asian countries that are often thought of as the more accepted Asians in the West. So you have your Chinese, Japanese, and Koreans that are often, when we move around in Western society, we are the stereotypical Asians. We are the ones who are often thought of as Asians. We are the ones that people will very easily and readily go to those restaurants and not think about it much at all. But there are others as well. And even in Asia, they're also kind of quote unquote second class. You have your Malaysians, your Indonesians, Filipinos among them. And then
that are treated that way.
Mm-hmm, yeah. Have often been at the been at the receiving end of the other empires, right? Japan had an empire that owned a good chunk of Asia for a long time. China had an empire for a very long time that overtook almost the entirety of Asia. Korea, similar story. You have and then of course their empires were invading each other and oppressing each other as well. But you have the Southeastern Asian countries that often kind of get perceived, especially in Western society, get perceived as sort of second class, right? And you think of how they came here, particularly contrasting Japanese and say Vietnamese, how the Japanese immigrated here versus how the Vietnamese immigrated here, particularly the last sort of set of major immigration, right? Japanese businessmen coming here in order to take advantage of the Western economy versus the Vietnamese coming here to escape a war. So it's so coming to terms with
you're also Filipino.
Yeah. And not necessarily coming to terms, but acknowledging that. I think the racism even within Asian American or Western, Asians in Western countries, there does seem to be a little bit of that. And I think some of it comes from where we all came from historically. And some of it is also kind of perpetuated by supremacist attitudes here in the West, because we adopt what we get from white people, as white people are the drivers and controllers of our Western society. And they have put us into a hierarchy of what's at the top and what's at the bottom. So that's a hard one to kind of wrestle with as well.
Right. So the question of what you wish white people knew about engaging conversations about your heritage, your Japanese heritage or your Filipino heritage. But I find they like to latch onto your
and that's why I brought that into the conversation, was because what makes me is a number of different things, and it's not just that I'm of Japanese descent, which it feels like tokenizing too when I meet I meet a white person, and within 5 minutes of meeting them, they're asking me what I think of Death Note. They're asking me, what's your favorite sushi restaurant? Why are you asking for sushi restaurant recommendations from me?
Japanese. So it's the first thing that they're sort of noticing before, and I don't know. Could it be some like validation? You need me to validate your love of particular anime? Like, I don't know how to approach. I think white people are sometimes so excited about Japanese culture. I've noticed it in particular, how much there's like almost a fetishizing of it. And I've seen how white people react to you sometimes knowing you're Japanese, and how excited they get first thing about your culture. And it's flattering, but at the same time, like you said, tokenizing, kind of weird almost as a way to get to know you or to jump into a conversation when they don't know you.
It is weird. There are things that I would love to get through before diving
you wouldn't mind having those conversations, but maybe not right off the bat. Yeah. Would that be accurate?
No, of course. And I think because sometimes when you want to get to know a person, get to know them at an individual level. And sure, I do enjoy anime, but I'm not an anime aficionado. And yes, I love Japanese food, and it's a part of my culture and my heritage, but I love a good burger too. Ask me what my favorite pizza joint. I will gladly have a conversation about pizza and bagels.
Right. Being that you're from the New York area, New York City area, someone asking you about pizza and bagels will definitely get you excited as a start off conversation.
Exactly. I'll get into an argument with you about Taylor ham versus pork roll.
This is a New Jersey thing for anyone who doesn't know what he's going on about. Any New Jersey person will have a lot of opinions on this. Oh,
absolutely.
And I didn't know this was a thing until I met it. Okay. So we talked a little bit about, different. Oh,
anyway,
sorry.
before going into any of that, some things that I would love to kind of express in general when getting to know anyone, regardless of their racial or ethnic background, is get to know them as an individual. Don't go straight to the thing that's most visible about them that might not be the thing that they are most they're closest to or feel they want to be identified as. And yes, I am proud of my heritage, but it's fraught with all sorts of other baggage that is difficult for me to wrestle with and get into. And so when somebody asks me about anime, yes, I enjoy anime, but I'm not well versed. And it can be a little bit weird being Japanese American and then feeling like I need to know what they're talking about, and then feeling like I've let them down somehow because I don't have the knowledge that they're looking for or am expected to know, and then suddenly I'm not the Japanese American that they were wanting to get to know. And then the other side of that too is I think as somebody,
are you Japanese enough?
Yeah. Am I Asian enough? I don't speak Japanese.
Although we did walk into a Japanese restaurant and the things you're supposed to say. And I remember once they got into a whole conversation with you.
Yeah. So all I did was greet somebody Happy New Year, and
I was impressed.
I didn't understand what he wanted to talk about next. I think, and then when it comes to, my Filipino background, I think part of it is that A, I've never been to the Philippines. B, all of my Filipino relatives are here.
Whereas your Japanese family is over in Japan and you go visit them regularly.
Yeah. And sure, but I could go visit relatives in the Philippines, I suppose. I guess the difference is that I don't know them.
Your Lola's here.
Yeah. Everybody who I'm close to, all of my aunts and uncles, my grandmother, my grandfather when he was alive, they were all here. And they also kind of, our family gatherings were not stereotypically Filipino family gatherings. They were just sort of family gatherings. We didn't do stereotypically Filipino things. We didn't always eat Filipino food. We did from time to time, but it, to me, just felt like, this was family getting together. We spoke primarily English at our family gatherings. I mean, it wasn't uncommon to hear Tagalog spoken, but it wasn't the dominant language of our family. Even my Lola speaks English mostly.
I know you know a little bit of Tagalog. If they're speaking slow enough, you catch on to some of it, but you can't speak it.
No, I can't speak it.
But you catch enough sentences.
I know enough, and I can understand enough when my mom is talking about me to others, and I know
picked up certain words.
I know the topic of conversation. Yeah,
that's great.
So I can call her out on it. Like, I know you're talking about me, and I don't like where this conversation is going. But yeah, so like to me, I think probably part of the difficulty in being able to exude that side of my identity is that you
feel a bit of an outsider.
It's kind of tied into American for me. Right. It's sort of like, this is just what we've done as a family. This is just the Blanco family, you know? So it doesn't, to me, feel like there's any cultural affinity other than, you know, this is just my family getting together and my family doing our thing. All
right. So this sort of actually follows with what you were just talking about. When you're talking about, you know, Japanese, Filipino, the different sides of the Asian inside of you, the different Asian communities that you're a part of. And so my question would be, how are Asians all in this together?
Yeah. So I think part of it is that we can't escape the fact that we all look alike. There's a popular story about Vincent Chin, the Chinese guy who was, you know, on his bachelor party at a bar, and it was around the time, I think it was in the 70s or 80s, right around the time that the Japanese auto industry was really taking off in the West. You know, like people were buying Toyotas in droves. You first started hearing about these auto manufacturers, Toyota, Nissan, Honda, Mitsubishi, like these names that are ubiquitous now, but they were first starting to make a splash back then. And Mazda is another one. People were buying them up, which put a big dent in the American auto industry. You know, Ford, General Motors, Chevrolet, they were all struggling because of the influx of Japanese cars. And so there were these auto workers who had recently gotten laid off, and they were at this bar, and this guy, Vincent Chin, was having his bachelor party. And I'm not as familiar with the story as I really think I should be, but I'll just tell it as I remember it. And, you know, if anybody wants to comment on the episode and correct me, or, you know, just share the story as it should be.
Go look it up and learn about it.
Or go look it up and learn about it. I mean, I know his name, Vincent Chin. It's these two guys who had lost their job at, I think it was Ford or GM. They took out their anger on Vincent Chin and said, you know, we've lost our jobs because of you. And they beat him up and they killed him. Vincent Chin's not Japanese. He has nothing to do with the Japanese auto industry, as far as I was aware. But
to white people, he represented Asian people.
Exactly. And I think as ethnic minorities, especially those of us who have, you know, similar appearances, you know, who phenotypically present very similarly, I think it's important for us to kind of, in times of struggle, to not distance ourselves from each other, because that's not going to do any good. When we're walking down the street, nobody's going to look at me and think, oh, he's not Chinese, let me not call him a, you know, Chinese slur. Our struggle is each other's struggle. I think it's important for us to work together. I just think that we, as an Asian American community, and I think the events of the last couple of years have really sort of given us more of a shared story as Asian Americans. So while, you know, previously I would look at, let's say, my Korean American friends, and I would say, yeah, you know, we share a similar cultural heritage to a degree. You know, some of our foods share some similar ancestry, and we present similarly, but that's about it as far as, you know, our shared story. But I think the last couple of years have really sort of brought to the surface how closely related we all are, how tight-knit we need to be as a community. We're all fighting for the same things: Japanese Americans, Chinese Americans, Korean Americans, Vietnamese Americans, Filipino Americans. We're all fighting for the same things. I mean, part of why I wanted to talk about this was because of what had been happening throughout 2020 and 2021. We really hit a head in 2021, and I don't see it slowing down at all with the wave of violence against Asian Americans. It becomes too much. Eventually, it starts to hit. You just start to walk through life constantly in fear in places that you're not supposed to be afraid, right? Like Chinatown, supposed to be safe for Asian people. But just a block or 2 blocks away from Chinatown, a guy gets stabbed. A Chinese guy gets stabbed, and I think, I think of my own brother who was called a chink and got into a fight. I think of people who have made comments to me about bringing the virus here.
That seems to have been a catalyst. Maybe I'm wrong, but it seems to have, when the Asian hatred, and people have commented, oh, there's always been Asian hatred, and that's true. But there's been a recent wave of hatred towards the Asian community that seems very linked up with the fact that the virus originated in China. And some of the comments that you've gotten have been linked directly with that. Do you think this wave of Asian hatred ties up with that specifically, or is being used as the catalyst or excuse to stir up hatred?
I think I think that, at least from my own experience, I hadn't experienced the kind of vitriolic sort of comments or statements aimed directly at my racial identity at any point in the past. I had been made fun of, playground kind of, jokes about what I look like. Oh, Nate, do you see in 16:9 widescreen?
Wow. But
the straight up sort of, hurling of Asian slurs, the kind of accusations. I remember standing in line at a store, waiting outside a store back when the pandemic kind of first started, and we had these, lineups because of capacity limits at stores. And I remember this one guy in line behind me made a comment like, oh, how does it feel knowing your people brought this thing over here? How do I respond to that kind of thing? What do I say? What do I do? Trying to have, being in chat groups with my family, with my mom, my dad, my brother, having to talk about, being careful when taking a walk,
don't take walks.
Right. Don't go for a while. Like my grandma, the attacks on Asian women in particular, elderly Asian women,
was terrifying.
It's frightening. And I think that's especially difficult for Asians because of the way that our elderly are sort of heralded in our cultures. So it's a particular kind of wound when we see our elderly, being stabbed, being thrown up against walls, robbed, beaten. It stings at another level. It's the heart of our culture. So between those things and then the murders in Atlanta last year, bringing that even more to the surface. And
do you think that was a turning point for you on when Asian hatred took on a different note in terms of how you were feeling?
No, because that had started before. To me, seeing that it was like, yep, yeah, here we are. Of course, we got to this point. I think for me, where it hit me was when there was the news of that guy I guess he was just on the subway.
Manhattan.
Yeah, in Manhattan.
Near your home.
He was stabbed on the subway or getting off the subway platform. I think reading that headline, the comment or the headline was like, 36-year-old Asian man stabbed on the subway platform or something like that. And I think it hit so close to home because that is me. And that's my brother. I think it was this debilitating fear that at any moment something could happen. So, and then that reminder that you don't really belong here,
must feel like such a betrayal.
It's hard, because this is I don't have a home. This is my home. The struggle of being Asian American, particularly an Asian American who wasn't taught any of my family's languages, is that I can't go to the country where I would fit in. I can't live there. I can't exist in that space the way that I would exist at home.
Right.
But home isn't safe for me. It's not safe for people who look like me. So it's hard. It's scary. You want to feel safe at home. It's hard when you can't.
Yeah.
Anyway.
I just want to take the pause that we should give to this because it's a lot. And yeah, I'm really proud of you for wanting to go here today. Mm-hmm. I've watched you, I've held you when you've had your moments of just not being okay. And I know it's gone on for a long time. Do you, or did you find it hard to discuss or speak about Asian hatred? Was it harder than speaking up about other groups that were being targeted for you?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. I think, when in the aftermath of the George Floyd murder, it's easier to get loud because when you have your friends that you're talking to who are expressing to you what it feels like, I didn't have anything to really latch onto particularly specifically at the time. I don't know what the Black American experience is like, but I can connect it to my experience as an Asian American, and I can get out there and I can use my voice, and that's easy for me. But
you're the type that will speak up. I mean, I know you're always wearing your hockey stick is surrounded by the LGBTQ rainbow tape, and you're very vocal on other groups that are marginalized and oppressed when it came to this topic.
I think part of it too is that as a cisgender heterosexual man, I'm in a privileged position overall. So there is a little bit of imposter syndrome that I feel when talking about marginalization. I'm not. I'm in a very privileged, and as an Asian American, I also stand in a very privileged position.
As a man specifically,
yeah,
as male Asian.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And I, especially as an East Asian, because Southeast Asians and South Asians don't have that luxury that I do. So I think it's also more difficult. That was sort of a layer that I was fighting as well of, well,
you have the right to speak. Yeah, are you an imposter?
Am I an imposter? Should I be talking? Should that be me? And then there's the other side of it too, of like, this is my trauma, right? Like, I don't know that I have the energy to get into it. I don't know that I have the energy to talk about what's so deeply personal to me.
Right.
I look and I applaud, especially after what had happened, I applaud Black people for being able to do that, because I had so much trouble. It was so difficult for me to talk about it, about my people's trauma. So when I see Black people just getting up there and talking about their people's trauma, I'm in awe, because I remember how difficult it was for me to do that.
How exhausting.
It is exhausting. I guess what I would say is when you see people who are suffering and nobody's speaking up for them, or they're speaking up for themselves, lift up their voices and say something. Even if you like, and one of the things that I know often white people are afraid of is, not saying the right thing or saying the wrong thing.
I'm thinking too, telling people, when they introduce themselves to you to not fetishize your Japanese side. I'm like, a bunch of my white friends now are going to be scared they said the wrong thing to you. and Nate's loving and forgiving, and just to let my friends know that. And you might say the wrong thing. And that is part of life, right? Like, white people get very afraid that we I don't want to say white people, like I'm outside of it. We are afraid of making mistakes. And that's part of that white pseudo supremacy attitude that we're like, the whole white savior, all of those attitudes that we've been given. It's like, call a person racist, and it's the most crazy thing, the biggest insult you can give, where it's like, this is just about your actions and behaviors and learning how to do better.
Yeah. I mean, like Ibram Kendi said in his book, racist is like a name tag that you put on and take off at different points based on the actions that you are taking in that particular moment. Because in this moment, I could be anti-racist, but 5 minutes from now, I can be racist. And it's a movable identity. It's never something that like you're slapped with and, oh my God, like that's it. You're racist and you're labeled that for life.
Yeah. Side tangent, but maybe helpful for white people in terms of understanding this. But like, let's take sexism as a side topic, and, women can be sexist. I guess we can adopt patriarchal attitudes, and we might have to root those out of ourselves too. Like, it's not an indictment on everyone who is a certain, it's not like only men this applies to. Racism, sexism, all these things are attitudes in society that we all absorb, and we all have work to do on, like you were talking about, attitudes towards other Asian communities, right? Within the Asian community.
Yeah. And I mean, I know like there's no time to really get into it, but the way that Asian American communities have historically looked at Black American communities, or Black Americans at large, that's a conversation that also needs to be had. That Asian Americans who are aware of how our people have spoken about and to Black people, that's a conversation we all need to have in and amongst ourselves. But in any case,
that's interesting, because the next question I actually had written down is, are there challenges unique to Asian culture that make conversations around racism difficult in a unique way? Oh,
yeah, absolutely. And I'm no expert on this, and I don't have like answers really, like well articulated or prepared. But, I know of how difficult it can be even for myself to address how like perceptions in my family of Black people and what Black people are trying to fight for, at large as a community, I suppose. And they're all the same things that we're all trying to fight for. I think, the thing is, there's perhaps a fear because, I think one of the things that Asian Americans do notice is how Black people are treated by the police. And we don't want to be those people. We don't want to be treated like that. So the answer then isn't necessarily to address what is wrong with our law enforcement system in the country, but rather to fit in with white people, because there's also this sense of perpetual foreignness that we have in our communities, that the power brokers in our country can kick us out at any moment. It's happened. I mean, you think of Chinese Exclusion Act of 1865, and for 100 years, Chinese and people who look Chinese were not allowed to immigrate to the country. So it's not like this is a far-fetched fear that we have.
Then World War II, wasn't that like my grandfather fought in that war, and the concentration camps for Japanese happened. Yeah, so absolutely. Like people who'd been there and their parents have grown up in the U.S. and been born there were still.
So there is certainly that fear of being placed in those kinds of positions once again, and I think that probably is one of the unspoken or unconscious motivators for us not speaking up. But without us talking about it, without us addressing things, nothing will change.
Well, speaking of talking about it, would you be willing to talk about how the model minority myth plays into any of this? And you have a Not Your Model Minority hoodie that you got into trouble with one Sunday when we were leaving the house.
Yeah.
We want to talk about the model minority.
Yeah. So the model minority myth, and I know like we're running up against the clock here, but just to give a brief overview, the model minority myth is this idea that, Asians are the good minority in the U.S. And that's a myth that was created by, white supremacist ideals and is perpetuated by white supremacist ideals. And it basically, what it does is it holds Asians up against Black Americans, Latino, Hispanic Americans, and says, look at what they're doing and how they're acting within society. Be like them. If they can do it, so can you. But it ignores the history of Black oppression in the U.S. It ignores the history of generations of slavery and how anytime that Black people reach any modicum of success as community, as a group, they're shut down.
They've been crushed.
Exactly. You think of Tulsa, for instance. And then it also ignores the history of Asian immigration into the U.S. And you think of
handpicking the richest Asians to come over.
Right. There's provisions for East Asian immigration. The best, the brightest, the people who were able to get tickets to immigrate here. So that's I think one of the things that I do think is important for us to have conversations on, and maybe we could have that conversation another time.
What is Asian erasure? How does that play out?
That there's a lot. So Asian erasure can play out in mass media, pop culture, for instance, where there's very little Asian representation, and so there's this sense that we're being erased from pop culture. But and then there's also the way that we're represented in pop culture. There's the way that that Asians are shown when it comes to the male lead. It's very rare, with some changes now currently and a few exceptions scattered throughout history. But Asians by and large are often like the plucky sidekick, the comic relief, the nerd,
the kung fu artist.
Yes. Who is untouchable in any sort of, sexual way, right? He's not really treated as a sort of sexual lead like the white male is in films and television. And so
then Asian women.
Right. And then there's the exotification of Asian women, that they are some of the most objectified in pop culture and media. So that doesn't really speak to, I think where I would see Asian erasure in that in media, and I know many would disagree because it's a very big concept, but where I kind of would see it is in how our nuance as people and as individuals and as cultures is erased from popular media. So that's one sense, but there's the other sense in education, right? We don't talk about the Japanese internment camps. We don't talk about Chinese slavery. These are not things that are taught in U.S. history in most classrooms, and yet they're very, very crucial parts of our history. I mean, I think the Japanese concentration camps are given a brief mention if you're talking about World War II at large. And so many people just are unaware.
Right. That even happened.
Yeah. And so, Asian erasure takes place in that environment, in the classroom environment as well. We don't know our own history. And then Asian erasure, in the halls of power, whether the legislative branch, the judicial branch, the executive branch, it's very rare to see Asian Americans in those places of power. We had talked in the past about Andrew Yang and his run for the presidency, and then his mayoral run in New York City. I wasn't a fan of his policies, particularly during his mayoral candidacy. I think I didn't pay enough attention to him during the presidential primaries. I think I was obviously following Elizabeth Warren more closely, but I think, we see somebody and we latch onto them, and it's easy to latch onto them. And I think a lot of us are trying to get a better sense of the nuance of conversation that needs to be happening when it comes to candidates. But it's difficult to do that when we get excited about the fact that this is the first time we're seeing ourselves being represented on a national stage in that way. So
I guess sort of on topic of Asian erasure, but maybe on the other side of things, who are you following in the Asian community? Are there certain social media sites, platforms that are helping you in terms of just making you feel more connected, bringing awareness to you? I think you'd mentioned a podcast.
Yeah, I mean, Dear Asian Americans is one podcast. So Jerry Won, who hosts that podcast, is worth following. I particularly like Liz Kleinrock. You can find her on Instagram and Twitter. Next Shark is an account that I follow to keep track of Asian American news. So as far as books and authors go, Dear White Women, which is written by Misasha Suzuki Graham and Sarah Blanchard, and I think the sort of the tome that I would probably latch onto as a precursor book is a book called The Making of Asian America by Erica Lee. And so those are kind of, I guess, starting points for me as far as keeping abreast of what's going on in Asian America. Yeah. And then I think one organization to look into is the Korematsu Foundation. So if you're unfamiliar, Fred Korematsu was somebody who was interned at a Japanese concentration camp, and his daughter started a foundation in his name. And that is one of the organizations that I think is one of the better advocacy groups that are fighting for civil rights in the U.S. And they have, of course, a Facebook, Twitter, you can learn about what the work that they're doing and support them as well.
One of the points or the reasons why I wanted to do this interview with you, I think a lot of white people will learn a lot as they listen. I also hope that Asians who listen will also be encouraged by what you have to share by sharing your own story. And I guess as a question related, how have you engaged in self-care, considering this wave of violence, considering what 2021 has brought? What types of support or groups have fed your soul in terms of being in touch with your grief? How have you looked after yourself?
There's a Facebook group that I'm a part of that, I mean, there's a lot of venting that goes on in there. So sometimes you kind of got to walk away because it just becomes a lot, but it's fun to share memes with, Asian
Sometimes
related.
You got to laugh.
Yeah. And I don't know, gaming. I play video games sometimes just to decompress. And then of course, going to therapy, which I think is self-care for just about anyone and everything.
Right.
And that's sort of what began my latest foray into searching for a new therapist. I hadn't been in therapy for a while, and with everything that had hit with regards to Asian Americans during the pandemic, I felt
you needed support.
Maybe I need to talk to somebody. Mm-hmm. I had a bad experience with the first therapist that I.
So sometimes you need to shop around.
Yeah.
If you go find a therapist, you don't have to settle on the first one.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right. So I ended up finding a therapist that I feel very comfortable with now. Though I haven't really spoken and gone into this experience as far as my Asian American identity goes. This was a topic that I have yet to dive into.
But this was a topic that kind of encouraged you to go back to therapy.
Yeah. Yeah.
Who has reached out to you? What has that meant to you? And maybe that would be a good question in terms of helping white people know what's helpful out there. Yeah.
Sometimes, honestly, when you don't know what to say, sitting there silently is not the answer. Asking questions is often the better response, especially when you see something massive, like the killings in Atlanta, and to ask questions of your friends who share an identity with victims, right?
And does that look as simple as how are you doing?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Just, hey, I saw this take place in the news and I wanted to check on you.
Powerful, even though it's such a simple thing.
And even just admitting I don't really know what to say.
Right.
But I feel like you need somebody to talk to. So I'm here, I'm listening, I'm willing to just lend an ear, You
had some friends do that for you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And that's more powerful than trying to come up with something.
With a big monologue.
Right. Because you don't need to. You really don't.
Center yourself. Take some time to allow the other person to share where they're at.
Yeah.
What advice do you have for other Asians who are stressed out right now?
Stick together. Tell your stories to each other. And if you are a victim, get on to stopaapihate.org and tell them your story. Listen to each other's stories. I know I talked a lot about the idea of solidarity and how we as Chinese Americans, Japanese Americans, Korean Americans, etc., we all need to come together because we do have some pretty deep-seated divisions among us. Our experiences are not the same, but I think it's also worth talking about how our experiences are different and sharing our individual stories with each other as well, because I think that also helps to build some solidarity.
Speaking of individual stories, I had a fun question to end things off with.
Okay.
What did your grandpa first teach you to say in Japanese?
When I guess I was like 5-6 years old, and we were in Japan. My grandfather has this big, old booming voice. But he was a smoker, so it was raspy. In what little English he knew, he sat me on his knee and he said, "No, senora, English say grandpapa. Japanese say oji-chan. You say oji-chan." I would be like, a little kid, oji-chan.
I love that story so much. Yeah. Just makes me happy the first time you shared it with me. I was like, I gotta make you tell that story.
Yeah. I didn't know my oji-chan very well. He passed away when I was, I think, maybe 10 or 11 years old, and I'd only met him like maybe 3 times in my life, 2 or 3 times in my life. But that's the memory of him that's burned in my mind.
Thanks for sharing. Thank you so much, by the way, for being willing to go here. And I know this was initiated by you, not me this time around. Last time when I asked, it was too raw. There was way too much. It was right in the middle of everything. Yeah. I saved my questions in a notepad and you came to me on your own and were like, actually really want to talk about this. And I'm so glad that you have been willing to go there. And I know it's draining. Thank you so much. I love you. You're awesome.
Thanks.
And we hope that you guys have enjoyed listening to us dive into this and that you share it around. And then it motivates you to share your own stories as well. Yeah. Thank you for listening.
Before we finish up this episode, I want to invite you to share your story with us. Gail's cousin Glenn, who's Japanese Canadian, took some time to sit down with Gail and recount some of his own story after listening to this episode. If you'd like to share your own story, please visit our website, fullmutuality.com, and either leave us a quick voice message by clicking the pink microphone in the bottom right corner of the page, or send us an email by clicking the Contact tab at the top of the page. Each of us has our own unique story to share. Here's Glenn's.
Glenn, thank you so much. Thank you, cousin, for joining me, for being willing to do this conversation with me. I know you were saying to me how, this wasn't fresh in your mind because you had listened to it a few weeks ago, Nate's story, and that yours was quite different from him. And at the end, we were talking about the importance of sharing our stories. And I'm really thankful that you're willing to share a bit of yours. As my Japanese cousin, and I've known you as long as I've been alive, because I think you and my cousin Kathy got married when I was fairly young. So, yeah.
We've been married 41 years now.
Wow. Yeah, that's older than me.
So, yeah. so as I was saying, my grandfather came here in 1898, and he did the photo bride thing and went back to get my grandmother in 1906. And so our family's been in Canada for a long time. That's my mother's side of the family. And there were race riots in Vancouver in 1907 that my grandfather participated in. And he was there trying to protect the Japantown of Vancouver. And he never really talked about that. I only found that out checking out the Japanese Canadian history at the museum in Vancouver.
Wow.
So there's a lot of things that families don't talk about, and that was one of the things. So my family moved all over Vancouver. They lived all over Vancouver. My grandfather started to buy property when he was very young. One of the first things he did was he just saved money and buy another apartment or another house and rent that out to somebody else. So he would be one of the people that rented out places to new Japanese people coming over from Japan. And so the family's been here a long time. My mom was born in Vancouver in 1919, and my dad was born in Hiroshima in 1914. So, and he came over when he was 16. So he came over in 1930. So,
wow, right in the middle of
the Depression,
of all of that.
Right, 1930 would have been the Depression. It would have been just awful being here. So the family was interned during the Second World War. And
both of your parents, or your grandparents?
Yeah, well, the whole family, everybody.
Do you know how old your parents were when they were there?
My mom would have been like 20, I guess. 20, because it's 19.
You weren't born yet.
And then, so my dad came over here when he was 16, so that he would have been about 27 when he was interned. So he had already been working on the railroads in the interior of BC, so he was very familiar with the interior of BC. But I have no idea if my family suffered any discrimination back then, but I imagine they must have.
Yeah. But yet your mom and dad were actually both interned in
interned,
Canada.
Yeah, and they were, and then and Brian Mulrooney gave them $21,000 or $20,000, $500 or something like that, when he apologized. Wow. So that was the apology, and my family was fairly well off. My grandmother, my mom's mom, owned a general store, and she had a fleet of 3 taxis and 2 fishing boats that they owned that they would rent out. So and then all that stuff was lost during the war.
They didn't get back. They never got back their property.
No. the stories of that are very, when you go through the paperwork and you realize what you had, and then it just disappeared, and things were disappearing in a secure government lockup, and they would be put in the lockup, and then when you go back, they never came out, or they came out and got sold to somebody else or whatever. And so, wow. There's a lot of...
Were your parents open to talking about their experience there? Or was it... No.
Psychologically, I've read that it's like being raped. So you can think of what that's like. And then that's why my parents didn't want to talk about it, because they weren't sure if they weren't at fault. And even though my mom, like in her heart, knew that they weren't at fault, but it's just something that happened during the war. But we also thought that, it's wartime. So bad things happen to almost everybody. And this is just, a case that you're the alien race. And so they didn't know to trust you. But the issue also partially was that it was dangerous to be living in Vancouver, because there were people who would, firebomb your store or firebomb your house or something just to get rid of you.
Just because you were Asian.
Just because you're Japanese.
In Vancouver.
And the thing is that they didn't know Chinese and Japanese, right, apart?
Right.
So,
like when Nate was sharing too, it was like that, that whole, the Asian community, like he'll have Chinese slurs directed at him, but he's not Chinese. To most white people, there's no difference
made. Right.
If they're angry about the coronavirus, they're not going to be like, oh, you're Japanese, you're not Chinese. They're not going to bother making the distinction.
Exactly. Yeah. And now the only thing that's kind of cool is that we have a Marvel superhero that's Asian descent.
We really enjoyed watching that movie together, Nate and I. Thought it was very, very well done. So do you find it like a bit of a stark contrast knowing, your own, that you haven't really gone through anything, like your parents' experience and what they went through is horrific, considering that Canada did that. And then you've had this experience growing up where you have not had any, anything like that happen. Have you found that, has it been hard to process through that or to make sense of that?
Well, it took me a long time to realize how blessed I was. When I was a rotten little kid, and I always thought that, my parents are picking on me, and my parents used to tell me that I should always behave because people will remember it's the yellow guy that's doing something wrong. Or that has... That's
a lot of pressure. That's a lot of pressure to put... Like, your white kids don't have to worry about about worrying about that.
Yeah, because...
representing the whole entire race of people,
but the thing is, it's true, because people would remember me more because I was Japanese or because, I stand out. And
did you also find yourself in communities where you were the only Asian kid in your school, or was there a lot of other Asians around?
Fortunately, Rosemount High, for example, had lots of...
you went to my high school. That's true.
So there were a lot of Asian kids, but oddly enough, or maybe coincidentally, some of my best friends coming out of high school were Wei Chin, the Chinese guys, and the guys who sort of had a little bit of the same kind of cultural background or understanding.
You had to stick together.
Yeah, we sort of did, but at high school, all of my friends, they just treated me like one of the gang. They didn't treat me any differently. Didn't treat me special. Didn't treat me any worse. So it's just one of the guys.
Just fit right in with your peers.
I think one of the things is that I'm a pushy Asian too, so I'm hard to push around. And when I want something, I'll go get it, and I'll be aggressive about it. And so, from that point of view, I think it's a little easier to take when I act like white people.
Oh. When you push yourself around and don't let others take from you necessarily. Yeah. And try to think, yeah. So,
and my friends today they're still, some of my best friends are guys that I went to high school with, and wow. we all treat each other equally. And we're a little United Nations group of people, and there's a dozen of us that go to dinner about every 2 months or so, except during the pandemic. And
right.
And so we have, and lifelong friends kind of thing. So it's good.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Well, thank you for being willing to share some of your own story. It is quite different than Nate's, just even with your parents' history and your own background. And everyone has their own different story to tell. And I just, because you're my cousin, and, I didn't even actually know about Canadian internment until I think your daughter Allison was posting up about your family. And I was shocked. Like, these are not things I was taught about in school. And I was like, I can't believe this happened to my cousin's family. And it was something that, I was trying to wrap my head around, a country that's so inclusive doing this to part of their population. And the older I get and the more, different topics keep coming up, like what's going on with the natives and what they're uncovering, I'm realizing, that's a lot bigger than we're willing to admit sometimes.
I think the whole issue, though, around the indigenous people and the Japanese internment and stuff like that was the fact of there's a certain group of white people who felt in peril. The BC government was the government that was pushing to have the Japanese interned. And they were worried, and they used that as an excuse. And there were some racists in that government, and they used that as an excuse to intern the Japanese people. And so that, to me, is an indication of lack of respect, right? Fear, maybe, but it's a lack of respect. And the same thing happened to the indigenous people. There was a thought, there was certainly a lack of respect, but there was a thought that they had to, in order to be modern, they had to be like the white people, forgetting that the indigenous people had hundreds and thousands of years of history themselves and culture, and they wanted to wipe that all out. Yeah. And
there's a lot of that in our history that I think it's important to remember in order to not repeat history and to be aware of how we need to be different than that. We need to be aware of how that can creep in.
I think every person has to try to do that in the future. Because every now and then I'll say something or do something and I'll say, oh, that was not very sensitive. It wasn't very inclusive. Because I'm a 68-year-old guy. And so I have all these years of being not misogynistic, but, maybe not treating women as well as they should have been treated. So
you're learning. You're in process, as we all are, and learning and growing.
I'm always learning, right?
And hopefully we all are there, continuously learning.
And you have to be like that, or else it's just not going to work.
Well, I will say that I appreciate that about you, that you're somebody who learns and who grows and who wants to improve in those things. In all the years that I've known you as my cousin, I have never experienced a misogyny from you. I have never even seen the pushy side of you that you talk about, but I'll believe you on the younger version and what you did to get by. But I've always seen you as one of my more inclusive, welcoming, thoughtful cousins who will stand up for things when it's hard. I'll see you even on social media putting up things that are thoughtful to provoke other people, and I've always appreciated that about you. And so I'm really thankful that you were willing to come share some of your own story.
Thank you.
To add on to the conversation of being Asian American, because everyone has a different story and has had different experiences. Thank you, Glenn.
My pleasure. Take care.
If you enjoyed what you heard, please share it around. You can also spread the word through rating and reviewing us on the website or iTunes. If you haven't already, please subscribe to the podcast on your favorite app so you can be sure to get every new episode delivered straight to your device. If you don't have a favorite app yet, you can visit our website, fullmutuality.com, to find a list of all the apps we're available on. Thanks for listening.